Frances Andrade was a vivid and accomplished woman, a precociously talented violinist, a much-loved mother of 4 children. She'll be remembered, though, as a victim. First, a victim of serious, sustained sexual abuse as a child. Then, her family say, a victim of the legal system that was trying 30 years later to bring her abuser to justice. Having to relive those traumatic experiences in court, perhaps worse, being accused by the defence barrister of telling a pack of lies, of fantasising, apparently proved too much. Last week she committed suicide. She'd had to be persuaded to give evidence against the abuser, her childhood music teacher. We are now told she tried to kill herself several times during the 2-year-long police inquiry. When she thought, wrongly as it turned out, he was going to be found not guilty, she seems to have made sure of death by injecting herself with an overdose of her diabetic husband's insulin. Tragic seems too small a word. How can we balance the interests of the victim with the defendant's right to have the accusations and the accuser rigorously tested in court? What can we do about the 1 in 4 prosecutions that fail because witnesses refuse to give evidence? Is our adversarial court process to blame? Would the continental system of judicial inquiry be a more caring, more moral route to justice? Justice may always have to be blind, but does it sometimes have to be cruel? Our last witness is Mark Williams-Thomas, who's a former CID officer, criminologist and child protection expert. Do you think it'd been better if Mrs. Andrade had refused to testify?
Well, I think it's a difficult issue because, of course, through the criminal justice system, it's the only way we can test evidence, and the individual himself wasn't accepting any responsibility. So the only way we could do that was through the system, and our judicial system is, I have to say, one of the best in the world. I've been around the world and seen other systems, and it is very, very good. That doesn't mean to say there aren't improvements that can be made, and I think what this case has done...
You talk about that, but according to the things I've read, there's something like 1 in 4 prosecutions collapse because witnesses won't give evidence. I mean, How does that make it one of the best systems in the world?
Well, the system of getting to court is different than the system of allowing people to come forward and give evidence in the first place. We, of course, are in a position now we've never been in before with regards to Jimmy Savile and the exposure, which has enabled people to have confidence to come forward. What we have to now be saying is, can we do things better in terms of dealing with that evidence when they come forward? And there is a 5-step process. The first step is the individual coming forward and giving evidence. That is the biggest step for an individual who's been abused to make. We then have to go to position of arrest, charge, going to court, and finally a conviction.
Giles Fraser.
You've said a number of times that you think it's that we should be sort of firmer insisting that witnesses and victims should come forward. It's their duty to do it. That they should have their resolve stiffened. And you've even said there's a moral pressure to testify. That's right, is it?
I think there is a moral pressure on some people. There's certainly, let's be very clear, the amount of victims I've spoken to and witnesses over many years. If you're a witness, I believe you have a very strong moral obligation to come forward.
Okay. So I'm interested in this business. So you have somebody who has been raped, and the extraordinary strong feelings that psychologists will talk about of confusion, of humiliation, of self-disgust, shame. It's an extraordinarily potent cocktail. And you want to add to this a sort of guilt trip on people to come forward and insist that they go into this system, which can be very, very bruising to people. And I just wonder whether, you've really got the perspective of, in this pressure, whether that's fair.
Well, I think for the first place is that I've spoken to many, many victims. I don't know how many you have spoken to. So I understand that situation far better than you do. But I think in terms of those people who are coming forward, we're talking about people who are coming forward as adults in relation to abuse they've suffered as a child. What we need to do is we need to deal with them better. And I think some of those issues with regards to how children are dealt with, children now have a very good system within court. What we need to do is we need to apply the system that we use to children to adults, because after all, these adults are giving evidence in relation to the abuse they suffered as a child. So let's deal with them as children.
I'm inviting you to take on a sort of greater self-critical vigilance about this, because this moral pressure to testify can easily be very adjacent to a form of manipulation. And these are people often who've been very manipulated already. Don't you feel in any way anxious about that?
No, and I don't, because it's a very clear process about sitting down with the individual. Many of these people will come forward years after because something has happened in their life. They've got children, they've got grandchildren, something they've seen on television which will have driven them to actually come forward and report. What we need to be able to say to these people, and it's very clear when I talk to these people, I do say to them, you have the opportunity to stop this. What we need to be saying to police is we need to improve the way we investigate so we're not taking single victims to court.
Claire Fox.
You mentioned the Savile case, and I was just wondering if you had any anxiety that saying that there's a moral pressure to report and to come forward as witnesses or and say that you're a victim can lead to a kind of hysterical atmosphere where people are kind of reporting all sorts of things and almost a kind of police trawling for people.
Well, I think there's obviously an issue with regards to police trawling, and that's something that's come up in the past. But I think we have to be very clear and distinctive in terms of what we're talking about. With regards to witnesses, I think anybody who witnesses an offence has a strong moral obligation to come forward and report that. I think in terms of victims, there is a moral responsibility that victims have. That is a difficult one because, of course, if they come forward and they're not dealt with properly, then, of course, that causes people the anxiety of coming forward in the first place.
But is there not a danger? I mean, one of the things I'm concerned about at the moment is that there's a danger, particularly with events from the past, of a kind of reinterpreting the past, almost a kind of bandwagon, which is, to present yourself as a victim has almost become fashionable. So the difficulty we have is that while some of them are undoubtedly, and in court people are found guilty, there are, we know, exaggerated sexual abuse being used both to rape but also to patting somebody on the bottom as though they're all the same thing.
Well,
all of these
things. Yes, there is, of course, a distinction. I think I would take umbrage to the fact you're saying that it's a fashion to come forward and report as a victim. What it actually is that we're in a position now where society has far more accepting of people to come forward and report, and that has to be a fantastic thing. So it isn't helpful to come out and say that it's a fashion thing. These people are coming forward who've been abused, and it's down to the police and those people to investigate, to establish whether or not it's truthful what they're telling you.
Okay, so that's important then, because I think one of the things which I think Theresa May said after this recent case was that, and it's got said an awful lot in relation to the furore around Savile, not particularly Savile himself, but was that victims should be believed. Now, the difficulty I've got with criminal justice in this statement is we don't know whether they are victims until we can assess and weigh up the evidence. In other words, what we should not do is believe them per se, but listen, but then cross-examine, find out whether... And is there a danger that the police now believe everyone and play safe and kind of may over-prosecute?
No, I think the example of believing somebody, I think exactly right. When someone comes forward and make an allegation, we should believe them. But what we should then do is test that evidence in respect of whether or not they're telling us it to be true. And we can test that through investigative interviewing. We can test that through the way we obtain the evidence and supportive corroborative evidence. So yes, we should. If somebody comes forward and makes an allegation, we must believe them. We shouldn't be being critical of them straight away and say we don't believe you. Because if not, if we're in a position where every victim comes forward and the starting point is we don't believe you, that is a terrible position to be in. And if that is something you would advocate, I think that's very, very sad.
And of course, you could characterise me as saying that somebody comes forward and says something happened to them and I say, I don't believe you, you're a liar. I'm obviously not suggesting that. I think it's a terrible tyranny with authoritarian and dangerous consequences if I'm told I have to believe them because they say they're a victim, because this can lead to false allegations, hysteria, witch hunts, as we've seen recently.
That's why we have to get the quality of investigation to improve.
Mark Williams-Thomas, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, what do we make of what we've been told? Michael Butler, our first witness, Pete Saunders, from the organisation that's very heavily involved in sexual abuse cases. I mean, his principal and starting line of argument was that that sexual abuse of this kind was of such a different order that it had to be treated differently in the way that the court processes and particularly the treatment of the apparent victims is concerned. Do you buy that?
Oh, I thought it was very striking that the first question you asked him, which was whether the adversarial system was the price for justice, led him to say that child abuse is at epidemic levels. Now, it wasn't any part of our programme this evening to test that particular assertion, but I must say I, for one, don't know it to be the case. And I'm therefore very worried about a stream of argument that flows from such an unproven assertion, at least as far as I'm concerned. But even if child abuse were at epidemic levels, I don't see that that would materially affect the way in which you took the matter to court and decided on guilt or innocence. So I really was quite worried that his whole approach to this issue was skewed by that particular perspective.
Giles Fraser, I got the impression from the angle of approach you brought that you would be more sympathetic to that line of argument.
Well, do you know, I think this is a genuine moral maze that we have here tonight, actually, with all of these things. And I think the moral maze is, the extent to which justice can be seasoned by mercy or, by humanity anyway. And I suspect that it's one of those situations that is very, very difficult to set in some alignment. I mean, I think that we probably have a criminal justice system that doesn't recognise fully the sort of vulnerability and needs of all the people who come, and they're seen in a sort of objective terms, which is a quality that's required by testing evidence. But I think that also sits uncomfortably with recognising the vulnerabilities. And it's those two things together what I think is the genuine maze here.
Don't you think, my first witness said, we shouldn't assassinate the character of witnesses, but the unfortunate thing about often in these cases is it does rest on particularly when it's being done decades afterwards, it does rest on the word of the witness, and therefore the integrity and truthfulness of the witness and character of the witness is pretty germane. Anne McKelvey, do you think that or
I
not?
think it is a moral maze, but I think there's a pretty clear way through the maze, and I think we heard it tonight. And where things seem to me to get muddled with Pete Saunders is that he had a kind of fork of logic. He did accept that there was a duty to give evidence. He did feel that he understood that Miss Andrade had felt that very strongly, and he seemed to be saying that this was in general a good thing, except in some cases where I was very unsure that he could tell what they were, or that any of us would be able to tell what they were in advance, when it would, for some individuals, be not a good thing, or in the worst case example here, a very tragic thing. So I cannot see, therefore, how, other than having a sort of human kindness about it, how you can see any way that this could be a morally superior system without forfeiting the claim to justice, which is extremely important.
Well, I think that one of the things that can be confusing in this discussion is given to us by Peter Saunders when he says there's an epidemic of child abuse, because I do think that what's happened is that particular crimes are now being given sort of some kind of privilege, and we're all frightened to challenge that privilege. If you say, no, I don't think that there's a special crime of sexual abuse or rape or something, you're immediately seen to be an apologist for paedophilia or rape. If you say that victims and witnesses, victims or not victims, that you've got to test them out until you prove whether they're victims in these instances, you can be seen to be being inhumane and not merciful. The reason I'm saying that is because I do think we've got to remember something. If you're accused of something like this, you've got the state, the police, the CPS and prison, your reputation to be thrown to the tatters against you, one little individual. And we've got to weigh the scales of justice to making sure they're not thrown up inside without due process.
Our second witness, Michael Portillo, Sally O'Neill, whom you accused of soft-soaping, did accept, I thought rather honestly, the fact that if you're appearing in court like this, there is an element of perhaps needing to be desensitised in relation to the predicaments of the witnesses and so on.
She did, but nonetheless, I thought her evidence demonstrated that the halfway house that many people advocate is actually very hard to attain. I mean, the first witness, Pete Saunders, talked about more training being needed in such cases. And the second witness, Sally O'Neill, talked about being proper and not doing things that were counterproductive and so on. But I did get the feeling, even though I tested her on this a number of times, I did get the feeling that that was a slightly sanitised version of what went on. I mean, it seems to me that these things are pretty robust, in fact, very robust, and that really pretty offensive accusations can be made against witnesses. But I really find it quite difficult to find out how you would do other.
Well, indeed, Professor Penny Cooper said that the cross-examination, Giles, should be adapted to the vulnerabilities of the witness, and that's fine when you're talking, as she did, about 4-year-olds or people with autism or something. But exactly how do you adapt the cross-examination to the less perceptible vulnerabilities that you've talked about so eloquently?
We mustn't get trapped in the idea that all moral issues are dualistic and that we're actually doing a sort of big battle of blacks and whites on this. Actually, some of the stuff that we need to sort out with regard to the sort of needs of justice and the needs of mercy can be careful, detailed, subtle and incremental. And I thought that we were trying to get her to sort of do a sort of black or white thing. And I thought she was very good at being careful and moderated in the way in which she was trying to sort of give a human perspective or to a system that can easily ignore that.
But she rather undermined your case, Giles, because she said at one point there's an argument that all witnesses are vulnerable. Well, there is indeed an argument that we're all vulnerable and all of us, under terrible strain, could fall apart. But courts are not therapy. And this attempt to conflate the two leaves you, I think, in an unsatisfactory place with both.
I think that's one of the dangers of the training, because you just know who the trainers are going to be, and what are they going to train to be is to be more like therapists than actually dispassionate, sometimes seemingly hard-nosed.
That's just not fair of therapists, and it's not fair of what was being said. But the idea that compassion can be a part of a rigorous cross-examination. If we really think these two things are completely different...
But we didn't say that. No,
we
didn't say that.
Michael?
Well, I was very worried at one moment by Mark Williams Thomas saying that adults who had been abused or said they'd been abused as children should be treated in the courts as though they were children. I mean, I thought that was an absolutely extraordinary assertion. Also, although I understood what he was getting at, that when someone comes forward, you should encourage people to come forward. But what he said was, we must believe them. And then, of course, we must test whether they're believable. Now, that struck me as an extraordinary piece of sophistry. And I go back to saying something I said earlier. I really think this assertion that people who come forward will be believed is profoundly unhelpful.
And his wider point about the moral duty to testify, to bear witness, is that a valid one?
No, I'm afraid at the moment, in relation to sex abuse in particular, it's become a bit more like therapy, because what people keep saying is you've got to get it out. You might think, I went through that, I got over it, I didn't, and so on. Now you're told you've got a moral obligation to speak out, otherwise abusers and abused everywhere will suffer. And I just think that's a terrible tyranny.
The idea you've got a moral obligation to do something that may destroy you is a terrible thing.
Okay, that's where we'll leave it. That's it for this week. From our panel, Anne McElvoy, Claire Fox, Michael Portillo and Giles Fraser. And from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.